The posterior pituitary gland, as you've learned now, is the neural part of the pituitary gland. So it shares a nerve connection with the hypothalamus and is basically an extension of the hypothalamus. The two hormones that it stores would be oxytocin, and oxytocin is responsible for triggering birth. It stimulates contraction of the myometrium of the uterus for birth, as well as stimulates ejection of milk from the breast tissue. The second hormone is antidiuretic hormone, which is ADH, and it prevents diuresis, which is urination, and it causes that water to return to blood vessels instead of being secreted as urine. So essentially, it would increase the blood volume by causing fluids to go back into the bloodstream. And when it does this, it increases blood pressure. So it's a hormone that is going to be released when the blood pressure drops. This is showing the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract, the connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary gland. As you can kind of see, this is the cell body. This is the neuron with the axon, and this is where in this case, the hormone is going to be stored, which is kind of like a neurotransmitter. You don't have to know the names of these nucleuses. You just need to know the name of the hormone that's made in the hypothalamus. And it's going to be stored in the posterior pituitary gland. And again, you don't have to know pars nervosa, just that these two hormones are stored in the posterior pituitary gland. On this slide, we have some pituitary gland hormones, and the chart is showing you ACTH, and the source of it would actually be in the anterior pituitary gland. You don't need to know this part, just that it's the anterior pituitary. So instead of knowing pars distalis, all you need to remember is that it's the anterior pituitary gland. The ACTH is going to stimulate the adrenal cortex, and that stimulates production of corticosteroid hormones. It also stimulates the production of another group of hormones, which are called mineral corticoids. And I'll be repeating this so it'll make more sense. The main mineral corticoid is what's called aldosterone because it increases the reabsorption of sodium. Another group of hormones is called gonadosteroids or gonadocorticoids, excuse me, gonadocorticoids. And this is a sex hormone because you can see the word gonad, and the main gonadocorticoid is male sex hormones called androgens. And the main corticosteroid is called cortisol. So there's actually three groups of hormones from the adrenal cortex. The corticosteroids, which are the cortisol, mineral corticoids, which are aldosterone, and gonadocorticoids, which are androgens. Also released from the specifically the gonadotropic cells of the anterior pituitary would be FSH as well as LH. Both of those hormones have the target organ of ovaries and testes. FSH is going to stimulate ovarian follicles, which is basically the cells that surround the developing egg in the ovary, as well as sperm production in the testes. Luteinizing hormone is going to stimulate ovulation, as well as estrogen and progesterone production. It also stimulates androgen synthesis in testes, which is testosterone. On this next chart is listing three more anterior pituitary hormones, They would be thyroid stimulating hormone. You don't need to know it as thyrotropin, so we'll cross that out. But the source of this hormone is the thyrotropic cells, basically the anterior pituitary gland. And again, we are crossing out pars distalis on each of the columns. But thyroid stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the thyroid gland to start making the thyroid hormone. And then that targets organs throughout the body. Prolactin is going to be released as well from specific cells called mammatropic cells in the anterior pituitary gland. And it binds to organs throughout the body, like the mammary glands, and it stimulates milk production in mammary glands during and after production. Growth hormone affects almost every cell in the body, and it stimulates increased growth and metabolism. So, for example, it causes synthesis of another hormone in the liver to stimulate growth at what's called the epiphyseal plate. And the epiphyseal plate is the growth plate. That's important during the up until we become full adults. Other hormones from the pituitary gland, in this case, stored in the posterior pituitary gland, are going to be antidiuretic hormone as well as oxytocin. Again, the nuclei are not important, so we're going to cross this row out. But the target cells, the effectors, are important. So the kidney would be the target for the antidiuretic hormone, and the uterus and mammary glands would be the target for oxytocin. ADH is going to stimulate reabsorption of water from the tubular fluid, thus raising blood pressure. And oxytocin is going to stimulate smooth muscle contraction in the uterine wall. So contraction of the smooth muscle, also of the male reproductive tract. So our first organ, which is outside of the brain, is the thyroid gland. In this view, we can see the different lobes of the thyroid gland, the different parts of it. And you can see that it sits just inferior to the larynx and also anterior to the trachea. If we look at the histology of the thyroid gland, you'll see that it has the thyroid follicle surrounded by follicular cells. These follicular cells look like they are simple cuboidal in shape, and there's also other cells next to the follicular cell called parafollicular cells. So both of these are going to have different functions. The parafollicular cells are between the thyroid follicles, so we can see them right here highlighted, and they secrete calcitonin in response to elevated blood calcium. So that means that calcitonin and parathyroid hormone are antagonistic hormones, even though parathyroid hormone is secreted from the glands which are on the posterior side of the thyroid gland. So if we go back and look at the thyroid gland and we were to flip it over to look at the posterior view, we would see parathyroid glands, which secrete the parathyroid hormone. And then within the thyroid gland itself, it contains the thyroid follicle, which is what makes the T3 and the T4, which is the thyroid hormone. And the parafollicular cell is what's going to produce the calcitonin. So there's actually two hormones secreted from the thyroid gland.